Patanjaliyana Divarangayachata Santi Dasata Arajaka Jatika Dese tu Dhammam Anukampi Bhajam.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Tonight I want to talk a bit about how these enlightenment factors support each other and how they kind of build on each other, build in a sequence. And I'm going to mostly be referring to the last section of the Mindfulness of In and Out Breathing Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118. So after the Buddha describes how to do in and out breathing, mindfulness of breathing, he talks about how mindfulness of breathing fulfills all four foundations of mindfulness. And then he talks about how the four foundations of mindfulness fulfill the 7 awakening factors. So that's the part we're going to look at. So at that point, the Buddha says, how do the 4 foundations of mindfulness, developed and cultivated, fulfill the 7 awakening factors? So the first answer to that question should be pretty obvious if we've been working with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, being mindful of the body, of feeling, mind, Dhamma, exploring these various foundations or establishments or objects of mindfulness, then it shouldn't be a very much of a step to see how the enlightenment factor of mindfulness is established. And the first thing the Buddha says about this is that on whatever occasion a practitioner abides contemplating an aspect of the body, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. Or you might translate it as desire and aversion for the world. So this is always part of mindfulness practice, is when we sit down to practice or whatever, walking practice, whatever. When we begin to practice, we turn away from whatever we want or want to get rid of relative to everything else. So when we talk about having put away covetousness, longing, desire for things in the world, or grief, or displeasure, what we don't like, we've set that aside. We've turned our mind away from those things. And on that occasion, their mindfulness is established and lucid. So, when we are doing a guided meditation, I say establish mindfulness. You may have a real sense of how that feels to really, have mindfulness established. And that part that's observing is engaged, observing, whatever it is we're putting our attention on. And we're lucid, we're clear. So, that factor of Sambojjhaṅga, the wisdom is there. There's a clarity, the mindfulness is sharp. And he said, then they develop it. And by development, it comes to fulfillment in them. So, as an awakening factor, that mindfulness is developed. And as it gets developed, it comes to a kind of fullness. And I think that really there's no better way to know what that's like than to do it. So you can really, pay attention to that cultivation of mindfulness in formal practice in a way that you can really experience it developing. And then there's an interesting note in Sutta Central right here about another way that we can get started on these factors. Other than mindfulness of in and out breathing or mindfulness meditation. And it comes in a sutta in the Samyutta Nikāya, number 46. So that's in the Enlightenment Factors, Awakening Factors book of the Samyutta Nikāya, number 3. It's entitled Ethics. And in there it says, when a practitioner is accomplished in ethics, immersion, knowledge, freedom, and the knowledge of vision. Sorry, let me start this again. First of all, what it actually says is a mendicant. So when a mendicant or monastic is accomplished in ethics, immersion, knowledge, freedom, or the knowledge and vision of freedom, even the sight of them is very helpful. So in Thailand, we might call it the Kruba Ajahns, or someone that you've been observing and you have a confidence that they have made some significant progress on the path, accomplished in ethics, accomplished in samadhi, in knowledge, freedom, or the knowledge and vision of freedom, which is a full awakening. And then I've seen this myself, and I've experienced this, seen this for other people, that other people have experienced this. Even seeing such people can be a really encouraging, can be very helpful. And then the Buddha says, even to hear them, approach them, pay homage to them, recollect them, or go forth following them is very helpful. And then he says, why is that? Because after hearing the teaching of such mendicants, a mendicant will live withdrawn in both body and mind as they recollect and think about that teaching. And at such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of mindfulness. They develop it, and in this, in Bodhisattv's translation, he says they develop it and perfect it. Any of us who have a challenge with perfectionism might not like that particular translation. It might be better to say it comes to fulfillment, something like that. And I really want you to notice how words affect you, because they really do. They affect us. And we can feel encouraged or we can feel discouraged just because it brings so much stuff along with it in meaning to us. So it's good to know. It's good to. It's another mindfulness task, right? And a good way for us to develop mindfulness is to be really aware of how what we're hearing lands and what emotions come with it and what other kinds of thoughts come with it. So that's a little aside. But in this case, after hearing or seeing or maybe even going forth under this, somewhat maybe fully enlightened teacher, then their mindfulness is strong and they withdraw. Their body and mind, they recollect this teaching. And then their mindfulness is activated. The factor of awakening of mindfulness is developed. And as they live mindfully in this way, they investigate, explore, and inquire into that teaching with wisdom. And at such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of the investigation of Dhamma. They develop it and bring it to fulfillment. So it's the same track that we're going to talk about that branches off of developing mindfulness through meditation. It's mindfulness developed through listening to the Dhamma. And there are instances through the suttas where people get enlightened from listening to the Dhamma. And so it's very important to understand that if you don't feel like you fit the mold, don't panic, don't get discouraged, because there are so many ways to really get to that point where we fully let go. And I'm going to talk about a different one tomorrow morning for the reflection, I think. Okay, so now we're at this point where, back to the Mindfulness of In and Out Breathing Sutta, it says, abiding thus mindful, they investigate and examine that state with wisdom. So instead of examining the teaching that they heard, they're examining the state of their mind, the state of what they're focused on in their meditation, in their mindfulness, with wisdom, and they embark upon a full inquiry into it. So they're really investigating at this point the state of your mind or your object. On whatever occasion, abiding thus mindful, a mendicant investigates and examines that state with wisdom and embarks upon a full inquiry into it. And on that occasion, the investigation of Dhamma, the Dhamma awakening factor, is aroused in them, and they develop it. And by developing it, it comes to fulfillment in them. Have you had an experience of this? When your mind is on your object, your mindfulness is sharp, you're observing, and you start to reflect upon that state of your mind or that object in front of you in accordance with Dhamma. And you're really investigating it. Maybe you're investigating it by exploring its impermanence or some other way, or some other Dhamma principles. Maybe you're exploring what happens in the mind. Like if you're focused on your breathing, If in the mindfulness of in and out breathing, the Buddha takes us through all four foundations. And you're exploring the activity of the mind, exploring the mind itself, the states of the mind developing. You can see other factors getting developed in that case. But what if your focus is on the mindfulness of the parts of the body, or mindfulness of the sound of silence, or mindfulness of a state of mind that's present and maybe common to you and prevalent that you really want to understand. And then looking at it through the lens of Dhamma, investigating its causes perhaps, or just think about how do you practice? How do you practice with these two factors, mindfulness and investigation of Dhamma? And of course, the last couple of days we've talked about quite a few things, ways of asking questions and allowing the answers to come up intuitively, that kind of thing. Sometimes we can, I've said before, we can identify a part of the Dhamma that we don't understand. Like you can imagine this person who visits this Kruba Ajahn and listens to a teaching, but you don't quite it hasn't completely become understandable to us yet. And you really want to focus on it and see if you can understand it. Like Ajahn Ganha will say things like, all religions are the same. They all have the same aim. You don't believe it just because he says so, You may need to really investigate that. And maybe the answer, the real answer, is not going to come just by having information about different religions. The real answer comes from the integration of that concept internally and recognizing the truth in that, even if you don't know about all religions on the planet. Just as an example. In one who investigates and examines the state, that object, with wisdom, and embarks upon a full inquiry into it, tireless energy is aroused. So when you really get into something, there's a lot of energy. On whatever occasion, tireless energy is aroused in a practitioner who investigates and examines that state with wisdom and embarks upon a full inquiry into it. On that occasion, the energy awakening factor is aroused in them and they develop it. And by development, it comes to fulfillment in them. We saw yesterday that we can cultivate the awakening factor of energy in other ways as well. We can think about how we can initiate something. Like maybe it's the exploration of something or some kind of meditation that we're doing, or maybe it's just something that we're doing more in the world. And observing how to stay persistent with it, follow through, and how to exert ourselves in it, and practicing cultivating energy. And we can do that with any kind of meditation too. Really bring up the energy. And maybe to some degree that's also bringing up enthusiasm. If our heart's really in it, we're going to get farther. In one who has aroused energy, unworldly rapture arises, or in one translation it's rapture that's not from the flesh, or sometimes this is piti, sometimes it's translated as joy, sometimes it's I was going to say sometimes it's translated as pleasure. I've seen that. It's how do you distinguish piti from sukha or pamojja? These are all things that could be translated as joy or happiness or pleasant feeling. One thing for sure is they're all talking about a spiritual feeling and not a feeling that comes from the sensual world. And PT is usually thought of, I think they can get away with calling it rapture because sometimes it can be very intense. And it's coarser and more vibrant usually than sukha, which is a more subtle, calmer, steadier kind of pleasant feeling. So this PT gets aroused. It's like, how it is when you're really excited about something, happy about something. But it's this happiness and enthusiasm and joy that comes from the practice and comes from the spiritual energy. That is spiritual energy. So in one who has aroused energy, unworldly rapture arises, and on whatever occasion this spiritual rapture arises in a practitioner who has aroused energy, on that occasion the rapture awakening factor is aroused in them, and they develop it, and by development it comes to fulfillment in them. And in one who is rapturous, the body and mind become tranquil. So a lot of times the sequence goes from piti to sukha in various ways that the Buddha talked about these things. But here it goes from piti to passaddhi, which is being really tranquil, really calm, really pleasant feeling. Definitely less ecstatic, like less excited, less tingly, if you will, than the piti is. And as we saw yesterday, we can come into this state by observing the body becoming really calm, really tranquil, and the mind becoming tranquil. And with any of these things, just notice when there's any amount of it there. The more we pay attention to the good things that are happening, the more they develop. So on that occasion, when the body and mind become tranquil in a mendicant who is rapturous, on that occasion, the tranquility awakening factor is aroused in them, and they develop it. And by developing it, it comes to fulfillment in them. Now, one thing to notice is as you're practicing, you can probably notice that just because you're experiencing like the tranquility, for instance, or when you're experiencing the piti, it's not like the other factors go away. They're still there. Mindfulness is still there. Really investigating or inquiring into what you're experiencing or into the Dhamma is there. The energy is there. So you may not have, they may not be as strong, there may be different levels of presence, but it's not like you're in one phase of this and then the next phase and the first phase goes away. It's like this can all kind of layer in. And the point is, each one gives a kind of encouragement or juice to the arising and development of the next one. And one whose body is tranquil and who feels pleasure, or sometimes it might be translated as bliss, the mind becomes immersed in samadhi. On whatever occasion the mind becomes immersed in samadhi, a mendicant whose body is tranquil and who feels pleasure, on that occasion the samadhi awakening factor is aroused in them. And they develop it. And by development, it comes to fulfillment in them. Another thing to remember as you practice is don't get too worried about what's what or what the definitions are. It's good to know these things, but when you're practicing, let it go. Ajahn Chah said, especially people who study a lot, they know all the lists and they know all the definitions, and he said, when you meditate, don't bring your books in there. It'll hold you back, it won't work. As soon as we start thinking, well, is this rapture? Or is this pleasure? Or is this PT? Or is this something? Just don't worry about it. You know you're going in the right direction, and you just keep going, watching it unfold, being present and letting go. The unfolding comes from letting go. This is why it's not really about, I'm going to make the effort for this to happen or that to happen. We can't really get it. It doesn't work that way. It's much more about setting up the conditions and then being present with it as it unfolds. And knowing how to fairly gently direct the mind to be focused on or present with what really helps to move it forward. And that's why it's good to, understand that how things affect each other and how it works. But when you're experiencing it, just kind of gently guide. There comes a point when you can't do anything, you can't guide anything, you're just mindful and clear and watching it happen. Then they closely watch over the mind, thus immersed in samadhi. And whatever occasion, a mendicant closely looks on with equanimity at the mind, thus immersed. On that occasion, the equanimity awakening factor is aroused in them, and they develop it, and by development it comes to fulfillment in them. So this you can see how that is, like the equanimity is there, and you're not doing anything to make it happen. You're just paying attention without wanting to get rid of anything or being affected by whatever you're experiencing. Equanimity means anything can come through and you're just stable. And then the Buddha goes on to say that you can do this whole sequence, same thing, starting with an aspect of feelings or an aspect of mind or an aspect of Dhamma. Any of the foundations of mindfulness, always with the having put away covetousness and grief for the world and developing these awakening factors in the same way just described. And he says that's how the 4 foundations of mindfulness, developed and cultivated, fulfill the 7 factors, the 7 awakening factors. And how mendicants do the 7 awakening factors, developed and cultivated, fulfill true knowledge and freedom. It's when a mendicant develops the awakening factors of mindfulness, investigation of Dhamma, energy, rapture, tranquility, immersion, and equanimity, which rely on seclusion, fading away, and cessation, and ripen as letting go. So it's like how, once we've developed these factors, how do they really provide the conditions for awakening, full awakening? And that's what it is. It's like we're doing it in the context of seclusion, viveka. So it's not just necessarily physical seclusion. It can be. It's helpful, as you've seen, to practice, to have space to yourself. But it's mentally really letting go of or turning inwards. And fading away is viraga. So the fading away of our clinging and craving, of our interest in sankharas, in the world of impermanent things that are constantly falling apart, and cessation, nirodha, the cessation of dukkha, of wanting to get rid of, and ripen in letting go. And these words, and this is in this case it's Vosagga, but these last 3 are the same words that the Buddha uses to talk about like what in the Dhamma reflection part of the 4 foundations of mindfulness in Anapanasati, in mindfulness of in and out breathing, he uses, that's what you're reflecting on. You're reflecting on, well, the first one in that case is impermanence, anicca. Here, he's talking about seclusion, but then the fading away is the same. In Anapanasati, you're reflecting on viraga, on the fading away. You're reflecting on nirodha, and you're reflecting on letting go. And in that case, the Pali word is patinisago. And it's like it's the same idea. So this is the sequence of experience, and we see this in other places too, not just in Anapanasati. In these things like the cascade of well-being, where you're seeing what takes us to samadhi, and then when wisdom arises, that sequence of going on the way to full awakening, and this is the same kind of sequence. And the note, there's a note that says, one of the purposes of this sutta is to show the deep interconnectedness of these practices. So, sometimes we can really observe how consistent the teachings are, how solid they are. And this is one of the ways we can see it. We just see these same states, these same terms showing up again and again, coming from different angles. So the Buddha said that's how the 7 awakening factors, when developed and cultivated, fulfill knowledge and freedom. So I'm not going to post that because I don't want you to think about it very much. I just want it to be there in the back of your mind. And, enough so you know how to guide your mind when you're practicing. And of course, if you need any assistance, leave us a note. But, just really put your time and attention, your effort into setting up the conditions that make this progression available, and be sure to be aware of any kind of influences that are discouraging or depleting. And running into hindrances is normal, or dukkha, any kind of pattern of dissatisfaction or desire. And when those things arise, then it's good that they show their face, because then you can work through it. And working through it and freeing yourself to be able to, again, come back to mindfulness and the whole sequence of things. You don't even have to remember how all that works. You just need to hold in your mind this interest in awakening, this interest in opening your heart to the Dhamma, really.